Hello and welcome to the Kitchen Table Theology podcast, where each week, Pastor Jeff Cranston explores biblical theology that provides practical life applications in an understandable way. Thanks for joining us at the table. Let's get started.
Hello again. Welcome back to Kitchen Table Theology. I'm your host, Tiffany Coker, and with Pastor Jeff Cranston, we're on a quest to learn what the Bible teaches about theological topics that many Christians find challenging, confusing, and out of their reach. And we're always aiming to do this in a way that applies to the lives we lead. We want to help you to be strong in your faith doctrinally, knowledgeable in and of the word theologically, and grow in your love for Jesus and others exponentially. Before we dive into today's podcast episode, we want to thank you, our listeners, for leaving ratings and reviews. One recent review, SDW Bluffton said, "So grateful for this podcast." Well, we are grateful for you. Thank you for your encouraging note and leaving that review. That really is what helps us get the word out to more and more people about kitchen table theology. We're also grateful for our partnership with Columbia International University. For 100 years, CIU has educated people from a biblical worldview to impact the nations with the message of Christ. They offer undergraduate, graduate, and seminary programs on campus and online designed for working adults. Be sure to check all of that out at ciu.edu. Let's go ahead and get started with today's episode.
Well, hi again, Kitchen Table Theologians. And as always, as Tiff just said, thanks for joining us. And it's good to be back with Tiffany, but I want to thank Aaron Pickering for the last 3 weeks. And we probably answered more questions than you wanted us to. With eschatology, but it's such a hot topic and a topic of huge interest to so many. So we thought it might be helpful. I hope that it was. And today we're going to spend this podcast doing a brief overview of the gospel according to Mark.
Yes, so I have been reading through the Bible recap written by Tara Lee Cobble, and Kitchen Table Theologians will link that for you in the show notes. But she gives each gospel writer a theme. So she says that Matthew writes from the view of Jesus as king. The Gospel of Mark is showing us Jesus as a servant. Luke is showing Jesus as a man, and John portrays Jesus as God. And I love just that different perspective on each of the four Gospels. So today, diving into Mark, we're going to see Jesus as a servant and how he serves others. Mark's Gospel is, I think, generally regarded as the oldest account that we have of the life of Jesus. It was written by a man named John Mark, actually, who I think I remember is a co-worker of Paul, if we can call him that. We read about him in the book of Acts.
Yeah, that's right. And since most believe that Mark was not himself an eyewitness of Jesus, however, that may not be true, as we'll see in a few moments. The Apostle Peter was likely his source. Actually, I wouldn't even say likely. I would say that Peter was his source, and many believe that Mark collected the stories that Peter told him and then carefully wove them together to present the life of Jesus and the truth about Jesus. I remember in the 90s picking up a book when I preached through the entire book of Mark over a 2-year period once, and one of the books that I picked up as a reference was called Peter's Scribe, I think was the name of it. Don't go looking it up because I probably have the name wrong, but a lot of people believe that Mark was just telling the stories of Christ as Peter told them to him.
All right, so we know that one of our earliest church fathers agreed that Mark wrote this, being Peter. He wrote it with Peter's permission and Peter's seal of approval. We also know that this book was read in the early churches. And just as a reminder, Mark is the second gospel in our New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But again, it is actually the oldest of the gospels.
Yeah, and I think what I find interesting about the gospel according to Mark is that Mark records Jesus' life, his miracles, the betrayal by Judas, his death, his resurrection, and Jesus commissioning his followers to take the gospel around the world. But as you read through the book, the gospel, Mark's stories are not arranged chronologically. Instead, they're put together in such a way to give us a quick, accurate view of Jesus. And this gospel You mentioned Jesus as servant a moment ago. And I think it also emphasizes two important characteristics of Jesus. Mark makes it very clear it's his authority as the Son of God, and secondly, his compassionate service to people, particularly in miracles. There's a lot of miracles in this book, and it's a book of action. As you read Mark's gospel, you'll see the word immediately repeated quite often. Mark, it's quick, like there's this quick, urgent, bold message about who Jesus is and what he does or what he did. And you just get the sense that Mark just always keeps it moving. And he's got to get the story out there. And you almost get the sense that he's writing this as quickly as he can.
Well, and it's interesting to notice, too, that he starts his gospel with the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist. He does not go back like some of the other gospel authors and give anything about Jesus's birth or as a young child or anything. Okay, taking all of that into account, we have to ask the question, why was the gospel according to Mark written? The opening verse, which I just said, gives us a very short answer to that. But maybe if I'll read it for us, you can expand on it just a little bit. Mark 1:1 says, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God.
Yeah, so Mark, right there, straight up, here's what this is about. And then in just 16 chapters, in every passage, every miracle, conversation Jesus had, the deeds that he did, all the things that we read about, he constantly points back to Jesus' authority as the Son of God. Mark, this book is a brief synopsis of Christ's life, and it really could have been meant for reading in one sitting or to be read to an audience at one time. It really is an exciting account of the Son of God that really could speak to the Jews and the non-Jews of Mark's day.
All right, so we said earlier that the book is written by John Mark. I am probably like most of our Kitchen Table Theology audience. I've heard of him, but really only because of this book, this gospel. What do we actually know about the man, John Mark?
Yeah, I think most of us are in that same boat. His name pops up every now and then in Scripture, but had he not written his book, he would have likely just been another Onesimus or Troas or Junia to us, names we see every now and then in the New Testament, but we really don't give them a second thought. From its earliest days, the name associated with this gospel has always been Mark's name. And the original title is Kata Markon, which means according to Mark. That appears in the very earliest manuscripts within 25 years of Christ's life. And so to attribute it to Mark, John Mark, is accurate, I think, for two reasons. First, Mark is a rather obscure character in the New Testament. So it seems unlikely that the church would have attributed a gospel to him unless he actually wrote it. And second, we have early attribution of Mark's authorship by the church father Papias or Papias, who was the bishop of Hierapolis. And that goes all the way back to the 2nd century AD. There was a church historian way back in the day also called Eusebius, and he quotes Papias, who himself is citing who he called the elder and who was most likely John the Apostle. And Eusebius, in quoting Papias, who's quoting John the Apostle, he wrote this: Mark became Peter's interpreter and wrote down accurately, but not in order, all that he remembered of the things said and done by the Lord. So this is a very early attribution, both that Mark wrote the gospel and that he was writing Peter's recollection of events.
Okay, you went pretty deep there, pretty fast. And I'm glad I didn't have to try to say any of those names. All good to
Well, and who knows if I said right.
It's good for us to know that we can accurately attribute this book to John Mark. Could you fill out his life for us just a little bit more? What are some things that we need to know about Mark? I think he was mentioned in other New Testament books.
Yeah, we first, outside of the Gospel of Mark and our touch with him there, we first hear about Mark in Acts 12:12. And in that verse, we learn that his mother Mary owned a house in Jerusalem where the church met. Mark, we also know, was the cousin of Barnabas. Colossians 4:10 tells us that. And then Mark went with Paul and Barnabas as an assistant or a helper on their very first missionary journey. They went to Cyprus and they also went to Galatia. And you can read about that in Acts 12 and 13. Well, midway through that missionary journey, Luke reports in the book of Acts that Mark returned to Jerusalem. And Paul viewed that as desertion. And so when he and Barnabas planned a second trip to Galatia, Paul refused to take Mark. That was probably really difficult for all involved, but sitting on this side of the fence, I just sort of find it funny because you think all these people in the Bible were so perfect and they got along so well. And Paul was like, I'm not taking that kid. He deserted us last time when we needed him. There's no way he's going back. So he refused. So Barnabas, now he's talking about your cousin if you're Barnabas. So Paul and Barnabas couldn't agree. So Barnabas took Mark and he went back to Cyprus. Paul chose another assistant, a guy by the name of Silas, and Paul and Silas returned to Galatia.
That is so interesting to me and also encouraging. Like, these are just humans. They fight, they argue, They refuse to travel together. I probably have a few people I wouldn't want to travel with.
And Paul was a hard-charging type A personality, and in many ways, I'm sure he could be a piece of work. So he wouldn't have been, I don't think, the easiest guy to work alongside of. Yeah, when Mark left, he said, that's it. I'm not messing with him anymore.
But it is encouraging to see, even though they are human and they have their issues, God still uses them, still works through them, still built the church with them, wrote these gospels that were inspired by God. So let's back to Paul and Mark specifically. Weren't they later reconciled? They came to some sort of agreement. I feel like I remember later on in some of Paul's other writings, he does talk about Mark in more of a favorable light. Is that right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. They were reconciled later, and in Philemon and in Colossians, Paul refers to him positively as the term he used was my fellow worker, Mark, my fellow worker. And then near the end of his life, Paul tells Timothy, Paul's writing to Timothy, Paul's in Rome, and he says, Timothy, when you come to Rome to visit me, bring Mark with you. And then he said this, since Mark is useful in ministry. And that's in 2 Timothy 4. And we also know Mark worked with the Apostle Peter a lot in Rome. And we learned this both from early church writings and also from 1 Peter 5:13, where Peter refers to Mark as my son. And so I did a real quick word study on that the other day. And what he was saying is, this is my spiritual child. So it's possible that obviously Peter was very influential in Mark's life and in Mark becoming a follower of Jesus. So Peter was Mark's spiritual child, his son, according to Peter.
Very cool to hear. I love when we just are able to link all of these New Testament people together and how they knew each other, their relationships. Let's summarize all of that quickly. We know that John Mark wrote this gospel. He's a close contemporary of both Paul and Peter. You mentioned that he is the cousin of Barnabas. And we know that since the earliest days of the church, this gospel's authorship has been attributed to him. Now let's go in a different direction, ask a different question. When and where do we know this book was written?
Yeah, it's always a good question to ask when you're trying to gain an overview of a Bible book. And to put it briefly, most of the evidence points most likely to this book being written in Rome. There's a strong theme of persecution throughout the gospel, and that sort of fits in well with a Roman setting. In AD 64, I'm sure many in our audience know this or recall this. A fire broke out in Rome. It burned a lot of the city down. Now, there were suspicions that the Emperor Nero's soldiers had started the fire or at least encouraged it to spread, because Nero, it was rumored, he wanted to claim some land back that apparently had been lost to him for his palace. And so to do that, he just burned down everything where he wanted the palace to go. That's never been proven. But in order to divert suspicion away from him, Nero blamed the Christians for the fire and he instigated this horrific persecution against them. And tradition tells us that both Peter and Paul were martyred for the faith during that very period. And it's likely that Mark wrote his gospel from Rome in the context of all that persecution, or just prior to it.
So about what years range maybe would that have been?
Yeah, Bible scholars fall into two camps on this. Some say he wrote it in the mid-50s, and others say he wrote it in the mid-60s. And I lean more to it being written in the 50s, about 20 years after Jesus' resurrection. And so Kitchen Table Theology, if you want to go do a deeper dive on that, a good study Bible, we'll fill you in more on the dating of Mark's gospel if you're interested. And it is interesting.
As with all of these biblical writings and all the different authors that we are learning about, we have sort of seen already that each author has their own style or their own flair. You can really see someone's personality coming through oftentimes in what they write. So do you think that is still true of Mark's writings? Because you mentioned earlier, he's writing Peter's stories. So if Peter is the one telling him these stories, Mark was not a direct eyewitness of Jesus. He was not one of the disciples, but he's writing Peter's stories. Does he reflect Peter's style?
Well, yeah, that's a really good observation. Good question. And I'd say, yeah, Mark does write in a way that's different from the other biblical authors, but that's a good thing. As I said a few moments ago, this is a gospel of action more than a gospel of words. And although Mark frequently refers to Jesus as a teacher, Mark records more miracles and less of Jesus' real teaching than the other gospels. So Mark loves a Greek word. It's ethos. He loves that word, which is frequently translated as immediately. I'd mentioned that earlier too, I think. And that's the way he just keeps advancing the story in this quick pace manner. You'll be reading, okay, such and such happened. And then immediately, then this next thing happened. You read a little bit longer. All of a sudden, immediately, then this next thing happened. And there is in the overall format of Mark's gospel, it is a narrative. He is telling a story, but it doesn't possess a continual or a continuous storyline. You could say it's more like a collection of units, like groupings. As you read through, you'll see there are crowd scenes. There are scenes with multitudes. There are small group scenes. There are public scenes. There are private scenes. And the resulting gospel is sort of this collage or a mosaic of the life of Jesus. And I think the best way to negotiate that style of writing is to if you were to regard yourself as Mark's traveling companion, as in a literary sense, as he assembles his documentary on the life of Christ. The main unifying element of the entire mosaic is Christ himself. But then he uses all these different settings and vignettes to tell these stories. There's a theologian and a Bible commentator named Mark Strauss. And as I was doing some reading on this, he shared two other aspects of the uniqueness of Mark's gospel. And the first he calls intercalation, probably a word that's a first for most of us. It certainly was to me. When I read it, intercalation. I had to look it up in the dictionary. So intercalation in the literary sense means to insert something in an existing story or sequence. And Mark did a lot of that.
All right. Definitely. That is the first time I have ever heard that word. You may have lost a few of us there. So break it down for us in a way that we can understand it, please.
Yeah, I think I've already mispronounced it once, so I'm going to try not to pronounce it even again. But no, intercalation. So think of it as sandwiching. You got a sandwich, you got a piece of bread, you've got a piece of meat or whatever in the middle, and then another piece of bread. In intercalation, when you're telling a story, you begin by telling the story, and then you interrupt it or you pause it by inserting another story. And when that one's finished, you come back to the original story and you complete it. And the reason that it's used by orators and writers is because the two episodes then mutually interpret one another. And Mark does that throughout his gospel.
Well, that is fascinating to me. I definitely did not know that. Can you give us an example from the Gospel of Mark to show us exactly what you're talking about here and how Mark did that sandwiching?
Yeah, I didn't know all this either. And I love it whenever I discover something about the Bible I didn't know before. So I did some research. In Mark 11, Jesus tries to find a fig on a tree. There were leaves on the fig tree. Jesus walks over to it. He's probably wanting a snack. He walks over to it, and there are no figs. It looks like it should have figs all over, but it has leaves on the tree. So he didn't find any figs. And then Jesus cursed the tree. And then Mark immediately moves into telling the story of Jesus in the temple and cleansing the temple and getting rid of the money changers and the vendors who were there making money. And he says, you're turning my Father's house into a den of thieves and so forth. And then as soon as Mark tells that story, he returns to the fig tree. And when Jesus' disciples walked back the same way they came, he had cursed it. It looked healthy. It had a bunch of green leaves all over it. And when they came back, it had already withered and died. So why would Mark place the temple cleansing in the middle of the story about the fig tree? Because the fig tree whole thing, it seemed weird. Like, why did Jesus get so angry at a tree that he cursed it? Well, he wasn't angry at the tree. He was using it as an illustration. So why would Mark put the temple cleansing in the middle of the fig tree story? Well, those stories, that's a story within a story, and it gives the reader this interpretive context. So Mark's telling us how to interpret the stories by placing them together.
Let's make sure we're getting this. So first of all, story A begins. Mm-hmm. Story B is told before we have finished with story A. But then once we finish story B, we go back and story A is then finished.
You've got it. That's exactly it.
Awesome. Mark does that to signal us as readers how we should interpret the story. It's an extra help for us.
Well, yeah, I think so, because we'll just go back to those two stories. In that example, the fig tree story gives the temple cleansing story some context. So in other words, the temple, and the point Jesus was making with it, the temple was like the fig tree. It shows leaves. It looks alive. It looks like it should function properly and it should be doing its job, but there's no actual fruit. So Mark's presenting Jesus as saying that the physical temple in Jerusalem and the practices surrounding it no longer bear fruit that is good in God's eyes. And if I can be real quick here, there's one more thing I want us to know about. Dr. Strauss not only will bring that part to an end, the intercalation part to an end. I just think that's really interesting. As you're reading through Mark, you might next time notice those things.
Right.
The other thing Dr. Strauss lets us know about, and I found this interesting too, is what he called triads, Triads, triads. And it's another literary feature common in the gospel according to Mark. You read things in groups of threes or triads. There are 3 boat scenes. There are 3 passion predictions. 3 times Jesus discovers the disciples sleeping. 3 times Peter denies Jesus. And these triads are often connected to the failure of the disciples. It's not a major part of Mark's gospel, but just something that I think is really interesting.
That is very interesting. I don't think I've ever noticed that before either. All right, we probably need to start wrapping this up. How about leaving us with an overall theme for the Gospel of Mark? What is it that he really is wanting us to discover as we read? You've given us maybe a little bit of an idea so far, but just end with the overall theme of Mark for us.
Yeah, well, we'll stay with the theme of the triad. I'll give you 3 purposes. Number 1, I think to preserve the gospel tradition in written form as the original apostles began to pass from the scene. It was so important that the life and ministry of Jesus and the apostles was put in written form. And so that may be the overriding purpose there, but that could be said to be true of any of the Bible books. Secondly, I think this book confirms that despite his crucifixion as a criminal, as it was seen by Rome and the religious leaders of Judaism, Jesus is indeed the mighty Messiah and the Son of God. Mark makes that plain over and over again. And then thirdly, I think it was written to call Christ followers to faithfulness and to perseverance in the face of suffering and persecution. The ultimate purpose and theme of Mark, I think, is to present and defend Jesus' universal call to discipleship. Mark just returns to that theme of discipleship over and over. And as the narrative unfolds, you can see Mark begin to categorize, and he probably does because this is the way that Peter saw it. He begins to categorize his main audience. You're either a follower of Jesus or you're an opponent of Jesus. There really isn't any middle ground there. And discipleship in Mark's gospel is essentially this relationship with Jesus. It's not following just some code of conduct. And he's teaching us there that fellowship with Christ marks the heart of the disciple's life. And that fellowship with Jesus includes that we trust him, we confess him, we take note of his conduct. In other words, I should pay attention to how Jesus lived, and I should do that. I need to follow his teaching. I want to be shaped by this relationship to him. And then ultimately, discipleship means being prepared to face the kind of rejection that Jesus faced.
And again, that would make sense, as you said, if he was writing from Rome and the Christians there were facing severe persecution. So I do love that overall theme and purpose is defending Jesus's call to discipleship. And that's really what it is about, is becoming a disciple of Jesus. Thank you for all that you shared with us and taught us this week about the Gospel of Mark. Thanks are also due to our friends at streamlinepodcast.com for their expertise in sound engineering and editing, and also our friends at Low Country Community Church here in Bluffton, South Carolina, for making this podcast possible. Thanks to you also, our listeners. We're always eager to hear from you. If you ever have any questions or just want to send us a note, you can email us at pastorjeff@lowcountrycc.org. If you have a minute, we would love if you would take some time to review or rate this podcast, especially on Spotify or iTunes. It really does help other people find Kitchen Table Theology. Don't forget, you can check out today's episode notes as well. We mentioned several verses, several resources, and we will be sure to put all of that information there for you on the show notes. If you're in need of an extra hit of theology between podcasts, you can head on over to jeffcranston.com for more information about Dr. Cranston, his books, his sermons, his leadership notes, and some blog posts. Lord willing, we'll be back next week with another great episode as we dive into an overview of the book of Leviticus, I think.
My word, Leviticus.
Get ready for Leviticus.
Oh, man. Okay. Yeah, we'll dive right in.
We'll have a lot to learn there, I'm sure. There it is. Now go deeper. And until next time, Kitchen Table Theologians, always remember that the real power of theology is not only knowing it, but applying it.
You've been listening to the Kitchen Table Theology Podcast with Pastor Jeff Cranston. Join us next time for more insights into biblical truth. If you'd like to know more on today's topic, please check out our show notes. If you have a question from today's podcast, kindly email us at pastorjeff@lowcountrycc.org. If you're enjoying this podcast, would you consider leaving a rating and review? We deeply appreciate your help in getting the word out. And be sure to subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or in your favorite podcasting app to continue this journey with us as we learn about and apply God's Word to our lives. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time here at Kitchen Table Theology.